Hello guys, welcome to Phoenix What If. So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto awakened the power of Gamuza and fell in love with Nell? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. The Echo of a Forgotten Song. The rain was a cold, indifferent chisel, carving away the last of the world's warmth. It fell in sheets, washing the blood from the stone giants' faces and pooling in the basin of the Val. Lay where two boys had tried to tear reality apart. One had succeeded. Naruto Uzumaki lay on his back, the unforgiving rock a mirror to the hardness in his chest. Each breath was a shallow, ragged thing. A thief stealing air that tasted of ozone and failure. The hole in his chest, where Sasuke's Chidori had ripped through him, felt like a void. It wasn't just flesh that had been torn. A promise, bright and binding, had been severed. He had sworn on his life, on his dream, that he would bring Sasuke back. He had failed. The word echoed in the hollow space inside him, a final, damning judgment. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. The orange of his jumpsuit was stained dark with mud and something darker still. Across the water, on the shore beneath the impassive gaze of Madara Uchiha's statue, there was nothing. Sasuke was gone. The silence he left behind was louder than any battle cry, more absolute than any attack. It was the sound of an ending. Kyuubi's chakra, that familiar, furious warmth, had already sealed the worst of the physical wound. But it couldn't touch the one that mattered. He stumbled to his feet, his legs trembling not from exhaustion, but from the sheer, crushing weight of his broken oath. He had told Sakura, he had promised her. The memory of her pleading face, her desperate hope entrusted to him, was a fresh turn of the knife. He was weak. That was the truth of it. Stripped bare and ugly. For all his boasting, for all his bravado, for all the borrowed power that raged inside his gut, he hadn't been strong enough. Sasuke had sought a different kind of power, a darker path. And Naruto's bonds, his words, his Rasengan, none of it had been enough to pull him back from the edge. He sank to his knees at the water's edge, the rain plastering his blonde hair to his forehead. He stared at his own reflection, a distorted, wavering image of a boy who had lost everything that mattered. His fist clenched, knuckles white, and he slammed it against the wet stone. Once, twice, a third time. The pain was a distant, irrelevant thing. It did nothing to numb the gaping wound in his soul. It was in that moment, at the absolute nadir of his spirit, that the world fractured. It wasn't a sound. It was a cessation of sound, a sudden, deafening silence that swallowed the drumming of the rain and the rush of the waterfall. For a single, terrifying heartbeat, everything stopped. And then, it started again, but wrong. The world came back online, but it was playing a different song, tuned to a key he had never heard before. A low hum vibrated through the stone, up his arm, and into the base of his skull. It wasn't chakra. It was something older, something deeper. He looked up, his blue eyes wide, and the world he had known his entire life was gone. In its place was a tapestry of impossible, luminous beauty. Everything, the water, the stone, the very air he breathed, was woven from threads of light. They shimmered with a soft, internal luminescence, each one a different hue, a different texture. The waterfall was a torrent of cascading silver and blue threads, each droplet a tiny, perfect knot. The great stone statues were dense, interwove, tapestries of earthy brown and granite gray, their histories etched into the very fiber of their being. He could see his own hands, not as skin and bone, but as a complex pattern of vibrant orange and warm, sun-yellow threads. With a chaotic, furious vortex of crimson red coiled in his gut. He scrambled backward, a cry catching in his throat. This was no genjutsu. He could feel the gritty reality of the stone beneath his palms. The cold sting of the rain on his face. This was perception itself, twisted and remade. He was seeing the source code of the universe, the fundamental strings from which existence was woven. The hum grew louder, a resonant frequency that seemed to pull at the very threads of his being. He felt a strange sense of belonging. As if this impossible sight was not alien, but a forgotten mother tongue he was suddenly remembering. He could feel the flow of it, the rhythm of reality's pulse. He could feel the story of the rain, the ancient memory of the stone, the Lin. Gearing echo of his battle with Sasuke, a snarl of angry black and violet threads clashing against his own determined gold. His head swam with the sensory overload. It was too much, too bright, too loud. He squeezed his eyes shut. But it did no good. The image was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. He was drowning in a sea of light and sound. And then, above the overwhelming hum, came a new sound. A cheer. Not the sound of fabric ripping, but of space itself coming apart at the seams. His eyes snapped open. High above the valley, the air shimmered and then tore open, revealing not the stormy gray sky, but a slash of absolute starless black. It looked like a wound in the world, a gash in the fabric of the heavens. The edges of the tear bled a strange, corrupting energy that made the 3D of the world around it recoil and fray. From this wound, something fell. It was small, a dark shape tumbling end over end, plummeting toward the valley floor. It hit the churning water of the river with a distant splash. And the tear in the sky sealed itself shut, leaving behind only the indifferent rain and the world's new, terrible music. Naruto didn't think. He didn't have time to question the impossibility of what he had just witnessed. All he saw was someone in the water, someone who had fallen from that whatever it was. His body moved on pure, unthinking instinct. He pushed off the stone ledge, hitting the frigid water in a bracing shock. The current was strong, pulling at him, but he fought against it, his eyes scanning the churning surface. He saw a flash of green. He swam harder, his arms and legs pumping. His mind blessedly empty of everything but the singular goal of reaching that color. He found her caught in an eddy near the bank. It was a child, a little girl with vibrant, mint green hair fanned out in the water around her like a halo. She wore a tattered, bleach-white garment that seemed impossibly out of place in this world. A strange, partial bone mask, like the shattered remnants of a helmet, clung to the side of her head. There was a deep, ugly gash across her back, a wound that pulsed with a dark, foreign energy that made the threads of her existence look weak and frayed. He hooked his arms under her small body and dragged her toward the shore. She was unnervingly light, as if she were only half there. He laid her gently on the wet grass, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. She was unconscious, her face pale, a trickle of blood running from the corner of her mouth. He didn't know the first thing about medical ninjutsu. He was a brawler, a force of nature, not a healer. Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. He couldn't lose someone else. Not today, not now. He reached out, his hand hovering over the wound on her back. And as he did, his new perception focused. He could see the injury not just as torn flesh, but as severed threads. The bright, emerald green and stark white threads that composed her being were snapped and unraveling, leaking a pale, ethereal light into the air. He could feel her life slipping away, a song fading to a whisper. Without knowing why, he did what felt natural. He didn't push chakra into the wound. He focused on the broken threads. He reached out with his mind, with this new, humming sense, and took hold of the frayed ends. He didn't pull or force them. He coaxed them. He remembered how they were supposed to be. How a whole, unbroken thread of her life force should look and feel. He held that image in his mind, that feeling of wholeness, and gently guided the severed strands back toward each other. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, miraculously, the threads began to respond. They stretched, yearning for connection, and then they wove themselves back together. It was like watching a tapestry mend itself, the pattern seamlessly reforming as if it had never been torn. As the last thread locked into place, the physical wound on her back vanished. The skin was smooth and unbroken, not even a scar remaining. The dark energy that had clung to the injury dissipated like smoke. Naruto stared, his hand still hovering in the air. He had done that. He didn't know how, but he had. He checked her pulse. It was still faint, but it was steady. Her breathing, once shallow, was now deep and even. She was stable. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he sat back hard on the ground. The hum of the world receding to a manageable background thrum. The sheer impossibility of it all crashed down on him. The lights, the tear in the sky, this strange little girl, the miraculous healing. He was either dreaming or he had finally, completely lost his mind. He looked at the child sleeping peacefully on the grass. She stirred, a small frown creasing her brow, and mumbled something in her sleep. It was a single, nonsensical word. Ichigo. His heart ached. Whoever she was, wherever she had come from, she was alone. And she was hurt, in a way that went deeper than the wound he had just mended. He understood that kind of loneliness. It was a language he knew better than his own. He couldn't leave her here. Gently, he scooped her into his arms. She was small, fitting easily against his chest. She snuggled into the warmth of his jacket, her breathing a soft puff against his neck. The feeling was grounding. In the midst of the chaos and failure of his day, this one small act of protection felt real. It was something he could do. He stood up, his gaze sweeping over the valley one last time. The stone face of the first Hokage seemed to watch him with a silent, heavy judgment. This place was a monument to a broken friendship. He had tried to prevent history from repeating itself, and he had failed. But as he looked down at the child in his arms, a new resolve began to settle in his bones. His promise to Sakura was broken. His bond with Sasuke was in tatters. But his life wasn't over. He had a new promise to keep now, an unspoken one. He would protect this girl. He would figure out what was happening to him, to the world. He wouldn't fail again. With his small, strange burden held tight, Naruto Uzumaki turned his back on the valley of the end and began the long walk home. The world singing its new, secret song all around him. The journey back was a blur of muted colors and persistent humming. Naruto moved on autopilot, his body screaming with exhaustion but his mind too wired to allow him rest. The strange vision, the perception of the world as a weave of threads, remained. It was less overwhelming now, more like a constant, low-level static at the edge of his senses. He found he could, with concentration, push it into the background, allowing him to see the world as he always had, trees as bark and leaves, the path as dirt and stone. But the hum was always there, a reminder that the fundamental rules had changed. He walked through the night, the sleeping child in his arms a comforting weight. He didn't know who she was, but he felt a fierce, primal protectiveness toward her. It was a feeling that overshadowed his grief for Sasuke, a immediate, tangible responsibility that anchored him in the present. He couldn't fix his past, but he could damn well protect this child's future. Dawn was breaking as the great gates of Konoha came into view. The guards on duty stiffened as they saw his lone, battered figure emerge from the trees. Their expressions were a mixture of shock and grim expectation. They were looking past him, searching for the Uchiha who was supposed to be at his side. Their unspoken questions hung in the air, heavy and sharp. He didn't say a word, just walked past them with his head held high, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the early morning streets like a virus. He's alone. Where's the Uchiha? He failed. He ignored them. Their words were just threads of sound, flimsy and weak. They couldn't touch him. His first and only stop was the hospital. He had to make sure the girl was truly okay. He bypassed the front desk, his expression so grim and determined that none of the nurses dared to stop him. He found an empty room, laid the child gently on the bed, and stared at her for a long moment. She looked so small, so fragile. Who would be looking for her? Did she have a family? Naruto. He turned. Kakashi was leaning in the doorway, his single visible eye conveying a universe of exhaustion, disappointment, and concern. He looked from Naruto's bruised face to the sleeping girl on the bed, and a silent understanding passed between them. The mission was a failure. She was there, Naruto said, his voice hoarse. It was the only explanation he could offer. She was hurt. I found her. Kakashi's gaze lingered on the girl's strange clothes and the bone fragment on her head. I see. He didn't press for details, not yet. Tsunade-sama will want a report. Immediately. Naruto nodded. He gave the girl one last look before following his teacher out of the room, leaving her in the care of a bewildered-looking medic nin who had just arrived. The walk to the Hokage Tower was a march to the gallows. He could feel the eyes of the village on him, could feel their judgment. But beneath it, he could also feel the thrum of the village's threads, a complex, chaotic tapestry of will, loyalty, and fear. It was overwhelming, and he forced the perception away, focusing on the solid ground beneath his feet. Tsunade's office was suffocatingly tense. The fifth Hokage sat behind her desk, her hands steepled, her face a mask of cold fury. Shizune stood beside her, looking worried. But they weren't alone. On one side of the room stood Homura and Kaharu, the village elders, their faces etched with disapproval. On the other side, half hidden in the shadows, was a man Naruto despised with every fiber of his being. Danzo Shimura, his bandaged face and single, dark eye radiating a cold, predatory stillness. This wasn't a debriefing. It was an interrogation. Report. Tsunade snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Naruto stood straight, his hands clenched at his sides. He told them everything. He recounted the fight, the new, terrifying power Sasuke had wielded. The words they had exchanged. He didn't make excuses. He didn't soften the blow. He laid his failure bare for them all to see. I wasn't strong enough, he finished, his voice low but steady. I couldn't keep my promise. Sasuke is gone. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Kaharu was the first to speak, her voice thin and sharp. So the last loyal Uchiha has defected to Orochimaru. This is a grave blow to the village's military strength. It is a betrayal, Homura added, his gaze severe. And your failure to prevent it, Naruto, has put this village in danger. Naruto flinched but didn't argue. They were right. And the child? Danzo's voice slithered out from the shadows. It was quiet, but it commanded the attention of the entire room. Kakashi's report Menshio. Ned, you returned with an unknown individual. I found her in the valley, Naruto said, his jaw tight. She was injured. Injured. Tsunade leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. The initial medical check found no wounds on her whatsoever. She's perfectly healthy, if a bit malnourished. Explain. Naruto hesitated. How could he explain? How could he tell them that he had seen the world break apart and reform? That he had mended her wound by sheer force of will? They would think he was crazy. They would lock him up. I don't know, he said, hating the weakness in his own voice. When I found her, she was bleeding. By the time I got her to the hospital, it was gone. Danzo stepped forward into the light, his one eye boring into Naruto. An incredible, instantaneous recovery. And this child possesses a chakra signature unlike anything we have on record. It is dense, potent, and utterly alien. Where did she come from, boy? I told you, I don't know. Naruto's frustration boiled over. The sky, it opened up. She fell out. The elders exchanged skeptical glances. The sky opened up. Kaharu scoffed. Do you take us for fools? You expect us to believe such a childish fantasy? It's the truth. Enough. Tsunade slammed her palm on the desk, the wood cracking under the force of the blow. The room fell silent. Her glare swept over them all before finally settling on Naruto. It was a complex look, a mixture of anger, frustration, and a sliver of something else. Something he couldn't quite read. Naruto, she said, her voice dangerously calm. You were exhausted and injured. You were to go home and rest. You were not to leave your apartment until I summon you. An Anbu guard will be posted outside your door. Am I clear? It was a dismissal, and a prison sentence. And the girl? He asked, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. She will be placed in a secure ward at the hospital under the observation of Ibiki and his team. Danzo answered for her, a thin, predatory smile gracing his lips. We must ascertain the nature of the threat she poses. She's not a threat, Naruto yelled, taking a step forward. She's a little kid. She's scared and she's alone. Two Anbu operatives dropped from the ceiling, landing silently between Naruto and the desk. Their blank masks were impassive, but their message was clear. You were dismissed, Jinchuriki, Danzo said, his voice laced with finality. Naruto's fists trembled. He looked at Tsunade, a desperate plea in his eyes. She wouldn't meet his gaze. She was looking down at her desk, her expression unreadable. She was allowing this to happen. He felt a rage so pure and white-hot it almost choked him. They didn't care about the girl. To them, she was a weapon, a threat, a piece of intelligence to be dissected. They were going to hurt her. The hum, the secret music of the world, swelled in his ears. The threads of the room became sharp and clear. He saw the cold, rigid threads of Danzo's ambition, the weary, strained threads of Tsunade's authority, the taut, loyal threads of the Anbu. And he felt, for the first time, the terrifying, seductive whisper of the power that now lived inside him. He could do something. He could reach out and change this. He could make the ANBU's muscles forget how to move. He could convince the door to seal itself shut. He could rewrite this entire, infuriating scene. But he didn't. He remembered the girl's sleeping face. He remembered the feeling of protecting her. If he used this power now, like this, in anger, he would become exactly the monster they already thought he was. He would prove Danzo right. He reined in the power, forcing the threads to fade, pushing the hum back down until it was a mere whisper. He unclenched his fists. He met Danzo's gaze, his own blue eyes burning, with a cold fire that had never been there before. If you hurt her, Naruto said, his voice dangerously quiet, I will unravel you. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact, delivered with an unnerving certainty that made even Danzo's eye widen almost imperceptibly. Before anyone could react, Naruto turned on his heel and walked out of the office, the two Anbu falling into step behind him. He didn't look back. He walked through the halls of the tower and out into the fading daylight, a prisoner in his own village. He had failed his friend, been branded a liar, and was now powerless to protect the one person he had managed to save. But as he walked, he focused on the hum inside him. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't a monster. It was a tool, and he would learn to use it. He would become strong enough to protect what mattered. Not with loud boasts and borrowed power, but with a quiet, unshakable strength they would never see coming. The game had changed. He would learn the new rules, and he would win. For the little girl with green hair, he had to. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. Threads of Suspicion. The silence of his apartment was a living thing. It had weight and texture, pressing in on him from all sides. For years, Naruto had filled this small space with noise, with loud declarations of his future greatness, with the bubbling of instant ramen, with the sheer, boisterous energy of a boy desperate to be noticed. Now, that boy was gone, and the silence he left behind was profound. An Anbu operative, masked and silent, stood guard on the rooftop across the street. Another was stationed invisibly at his door. He was a prisoner in everything but name. The first day had been a torment of impotent rage. He'd paced the confines of his small living room like a caged animal, the injustice of it all a bitter pill in his throat. They hadn't even let him see Jiraiya when the old Sannin had returned to the village, no doubt feeding him the official story. Naruto, unstable after his mission failure, was under protective observation. It was a lie woven from threads of convenience and fear. But by the third day, the rage had cooled, simmering down into something colder, harder, and infinitely more useful: resolve. He sat cross-legged on the floor, his eyes closed. The world of threads was still there, a constant hum at the edge of his perception. At first, it had been a disorienting flood of information. Every object, every person, every gust of wind sang its own song, creating a cacophony that threatened to overwhelm him. But slowly, painstakingly, he was learning to listen. He was learning to distinguish the different melodies, to understand the harmony of the world's secret music. He started small. He focused on a cup on his table. He didn't just see a cup, he saw its history. He saw the faint, pale blue threads of the water it had held, the memory of its heat still a soft, warm echo. He saw the denser, earthy threads of the clay it was made from, and the flick of fiery orange from the kiln that had given it form. It was all there, a story waiting to be read. He reached out with his senses, not his hand, and focused on the single thread that defined its position in space. He didn't try to lift the cup with telekinesis or chakra. He simply suggested. He presented the universe with a compelling alternative. The cup is not on the table. The cup is in my hand. For a long moment, nothing happened. The universe seemed to consider his proposal. Then, with a flicker that was more a shift in reality than actual movement, the cup was no longer on the table. It was sitting solidly in his open palm. There was no sound, no gust of wind. It simply was. A slow smile spread across Naruto's face. This power, this Gamuza as a whisper in his mind had named it, wasn't about force. It wasn't a bigger Rasengan or a stronger clone. It was the power of persuasion. It was the ability to speak reality's native tongue and convince it to change its mind. He spent his days in quiet experimentation. He'd make his worn-out sneakers look brand new by coaxing the threads of their fabric to remember their original, unworn state. He fixed the leaky faucet in his bathroom not by tightening a bolt, but by convincing the pipe that it had never been cracked. These were small, inconsequential miracles, but each successful attempt built his confidence, honing his control. He learned that the more complex the change, the more focus it required, the more energy it drained from him. Erasing a scratch was simple. Making the cup move had left him winded. He couldn't imagine, what it would take to alter something as complex as a living being. The memory of healing the girl in the valley now seemed like a feat of impossible, instinct-driven strength. His thoughts always returned to her. He had no way of knowing what was happening to her in Ibiki's care. The thought of that cold, methodical man questioning a lost and terrified child made Naruto's blood run cold. He had to trust that Tsunade wouldn't let it go too far, but trust was a currency he was running desperately short on. On the evening of the 5th day, there was a knock at his door. Not the soft, coated rap of an anbu, but a firm, solid sound. He opened it to find Jiraiya standing there, his usual jovial expression replaced by a deep, troubled frown. Behind him, the anbu guard materialized from the shadows, his hand raised. "He's with me," Jiraiya said, his voice carrying an authority that even the masked operative couldn't dispute. The anbu hesitated, then melted back into the darkness. Jiraiya stepped inside, his large frame making the apartment feel even smaller. He didn't speak for a long moment, his eyes scanning Naruto, taking in the change. The frantic energy was gone. The loud desperation had been replaced by a quiet, unnerving stillness. "The elders believe you're suffering from a psychological break due to the mission," Jiraiya said bluntly, dropping a heavy scroll onto the table. "They think you invented the story about the sky to cope with your failure." "And what do you think, pervy sage?" Naruto asked, his voice even. Jiraiya sighed, running a hand through his wild white hair. "I think the world is a lot bigger and stranger than most people are willing to believe. I've been digging through the oldest archives, texts from before the founding of the villages. There are whispers, fragmented legends of individuals who could sing the world into being. They were called weavers. The stories claim they didn't use chakra, but spoke the language of creation itself. Most scholars dismiss it as myth. It's not a myth," Naruto said quietly. He looked at the cup still in his hand, then back at his master. He focused, suggesting to reality that the cup was now filled with hot, fragrant tea. Steam immediately began to rise from its rim. He held it out to Jiraiya. Jiraiya stared, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. He took the cup, his fingers tracing its warmth. He looked from the cup to Naruto, and for the first time, he seemed to be seeing his student not as the container for the 9 tails, but as something entirely new. Something potentially far more powerful, and far more dangerous. "What is this, Naruto?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Naruto admitted. "It just woke up." In the valley. Before they could continue, another knock came at the door, this one lighter, more hesitant. Jiraiya opened it to reveal Shizune, and behind her, holding her hand, was the little girl with green hair. Naruto's breath caught in his chest. She was dressed in simple, clean clothes that were too big for her, and she looked tired and scared, but she was physically unharmed. Her wide, amber eyes scanned the room nervously until they landed on Naruto. A flicker of recognition, of relief, passed over her face. "They weren't getting anywhere," Shizune explained, her expression weary. "She won't speak to anyone. She barely eats. She just sits in her room, staring at the wall. Unless I bring her to you." She gestured helplessly at the small girl, who was now hiding timidly behind her legs, peeking out at Naruto. "Tsunade-sama has bent the rules. She's giving you 24 hours. If you can get her to talk, to tell us anything, she can stay in your custody. If not," Shizune didn't need to finish the sentence. "If not, she would go back to Danzo's sphere of influence, to become a research subject in a cold, dark room." Naruto's heart, which had been a cold, hard knot for days, suddenly ached. He knelt down, bringing himself to the girl's eye level. He didn't move closer, didn't want to scare her. He just looked at her, offering a small, gentle smile. "Hey," he said softly. "I'm Naruto. Remember me? We met at the river." The girl's amber eyes were huge in her small face. She stared at him, a universe of fear and confusion swirling in their depths. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, her small hands twisting in the fabric of Shizune's pants. Tsunade-sama sent us some food, Shizune said, placing a small bento box on the table. It was practical, nutritious, and utterly unappealing. Naruto glanced at the box and then back at the girl. He saw the way she eyed it with suspicion, her small body tense with mistrust. He knew that look. It was the look of a child who had learned that the world was not a kind place. Force and logic wouldn't work here. He had to speak a different language. He stood up and walked into his small kitchen, ignoring the food box completely. He rummaged through his cupboards, making a deliberate amount of noise, before pulling out his secret weapon, a cup of instant ramen. He filled his kettle, his movements casual and unhurried. He was intensely aware of the 3 sets of eyes on him. But he focused all his attention on the little girl. He was putting on a show for an audience of 1. As the kettle began to whistle, he poured the steaming water into the cup. The familiar scent of broth and rehydrated pork filling the small apartment. He peeled back the lid, waved the steam toward his nose with a theatrical sniff of appreciation, and let out a satisfied, "Ah." He sat back down on the floor, a good distance away from her, and picked up his chopsticks. "Well, I'm starving," he announced to no one in particular. He slurped the noodles with exaggerated gusto, making sure to get broth all over his face. The girl watched his every move. Her fear was still there, but it was now mingled with a hesitant curiosity. Shizune and Jiraiya stood by the door, silent observers to the strange, delicate negotiation taking place. After a few bites, Naruto paused. He looked at her, then at his ramen, as if just realizing she was there. "You want some?" She flinched back, shaking her head quickly. "No, okay, more for me then," he said with a shrug, and went back to eating. He finished the first cup in record time and, without a word, got up to make another. This time, he placed the fresh, steaming cup on the floor midway between them. He sat down and started on a 3rd cup for himself. He didn't press her. He didn't coax her. He just ate, occasionally glancing at her. A silent invitation in his eyes. For 5 long minutes, she didn't move. Then, slowly, cautiously, she crept forward. She knelt before the cup of ramen, staring into the broth as if it held the secrets of the universe. She picked up the plastic fork he'd left beside it, poked at a piece of corn, and then, finally, took a small, tentative bite. Her eyes widened slightly. She took another, bigger bite. A moment later, she was slurping the noodles down with a surprising speed, a small spot of broth dotting her nose. A genuine, unforced smile broke across Naruto's face. It was the first time he had truly smiled in days. He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the ramen. It was a feeling of connection, of a small, fragile thread of trust being woven between them. She finished the entire cup. She looked up at him, her lips shiny with broth, and for the first time, her expression wasn't one of fear. It was contentment. She pointed a small finger at his chest, then at herself. A questioning look in her eyes. I'm Naruto," he said again, pointing to himself. He then pointed at her. "Who are you?" She frowned in concentration, her small brow furrowed. She opened her mouth, and a small, raspy sound came out. "Ru," she managed, her voice weak from disuse. Naruto repeated. She shook her head, frustrated. She tried again, concentrating harder. Nell, Naruto said, the name feeling right on his tongue. "It's nice to meet you, Nell." She beamed, a wide, innocent smile that transformed her entire face. It was like watching the sun break through the clouds. And in that moment, Naruto knew, with an absolute certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would let the entire world burn before he let anyone take that smile away from her. From the doorway, Jiraiya looked at Shizune. "It's not just that she trusts him," he murmured, his voice low. "It's like they're tuned to the same frequency. Look at him. He's not he's same boy who left the village a week ago." Shizune simply nodded, a look of profound relief on her face. The experiment was a success. When they had gone, leaving Nell officially in his care, a new, comfortable silence settled over the apartment. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by the quiet presence of another person. It made the room feel less like a prison and more like a home. As the evening wore on, Naruto watched her. He looked at her with his new eyes, the vision of threads he now called Gamuza. He saw her not just as a little girl, but as a complex and beautiful tapestry. Her threads were a stark, brilliant white, interwoven with an emerald green so pure it ached to look at. But woven throughout were gaps, snapped threads that led nowhere. The threads of memory. He could see the damage, the emptiness where her past should have been. It wasn't a physical wound he could mend with a simple suggestion. This was a soul-deep injury, a story that had been violently torn apart. Mending this would require more than power. It would require time, and patience, and trust. Later, as Nell's eyes began to droop, Naruto realized he had a problem. He had one bed, and one lumpy futon. He pulled the futon out, fluffed the pillow, and laid his spare blanket over it. He gently picked Nell up, her body limp with sleep, and tucked her into his own bed. She was so small she barely made a dent in the mattress. He stood over her for a moment, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. "My name's Naruto," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I don't know who you are or where you came from, but I promise. No one's ever going to hurt you again. I'll be here." As if hearing him in her sleep, she turned her head, a single word escaping her lips in a soft sigh. "Naruto." He smiled and turned to his makeshift bed on the floor, a sense of purpose settling over him like a warm blanket. He was no longer just Naruto Uzumaki, the failed ninja, the lonely Jinchuriki. He was Naruto, and he was Nell's protector. It was a start. Miles away, in a different plane of existence entirely, a world of stark white sands and a perpetual moonlit sky, a different kind of observation was taking place. A Shinigami, a member of the Gote 13's secretive Onmitsukido, stood cloaked in the shadow of a dead, white tree. His name was Kato, and he was a specialist in tracking spiritual anomalies. Days ago, his instruments had detected a violent tremor in the fabric of reality, a sea-lie, a shredding, of the veil between worlds. The epicenter was a place his maps called the Elemental Nations. He had been dispatched to investigate. Crossing the dimensional gap was a risky and precise art, but he was one of the best. He had arrived on the outskirts of a massive, hidden village, a place teeming with a strange, vibrant energy the locals called chakra. It was powerful, but it was familiar in its structure, a different flavor of the reishi he understood. He could sense it, measure it, and categorize it. But then, he had felt it. The source of the tremor. It wasn't a spike of energy. It was the opposite. It was a zone of quiet. A place where the rules of spiritual energy seemed to bend and fray. His senses, honed over a century of tracking hollows and rogue souls, screamed at him in confusion. Now, perched on a branch overlooking the village of Konoha, he focused his full spiritual perception on the epicenter. It was coming from a small apartment in the center of the village. He closed his eyes, filtering out the thousands of chakra signatures, searching for the anomaly. And then he found it. It wasn't a ryutsu he could measure. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was something far more terrifying. He felt as though he had been listening to an orchestra his entire life, and had just heard the composer clear his throat. The power emanating from that apartment didn't just exist within the world, it was acting upon the world. It was a pressure not of energy, but of will, a fund. A mental force that convinced reality to be something other than it was. Kato felt a cold, paralyzing terror grip him, a fear more profound than facing 1,000 hollows. A hollow could devour your soul. This power could convince the universe that your soul had never existed in the first place. He opened his eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to report this. Immediately. This wasn't a simple cross-dimensional anomaly. This was a threat to the fundamental balance of all worlds. He drew a deep, shuddering breath and whispered into his communicator, a device that sent thoughts across dimensions. "This is Scout Kato to Captain Izanagi. I have located the source of the reality fracture. Sir, the anomaly is not a being of immense power. The anomaly is foundational." Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. The Ghostly Blade of Seraite. The air in the 1st Division barracks of the Gote 13 was old, heavy with the weight of centuries of command. It smelled of ink, aged wood, and ozone. Here, history was not a subject to be studied, it was a living presence, and its most formidable embodiment sat at the head of the room. Captain Commander Genryusai Shigekuni Yamamoto listened, his ancient eyes closed, his gnarled hands resting atop his cane. To an outside observer, he might have appeared to be sleeping. Captain Kenshin Izanagi knew better. The old man was listening with an intensity that could feel the shifting of atoms. Kenshin stood at attention, his own posture a study in rigid discipline. He was the captain of the 8th Division, a man known for his unflinching pragmatism and his mastery of Kido. His face was sharp, intelligent, and perpetually severe, framed by dark hair tied back in a neat, functional tail. He did not deal in hypotheticals or hyperbole, which was why his report was so deeply unsettling. Scout Kato's final assessment was unequivocal. Commander, Kenshin concluded, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the cold dread the words inspired. He described the anomaly's power not as a measurable force, but as foundational. It does not act within the laws of Reishi and the spiritual world, it appears to act upon those laws. Since his report, we have lost contact with him. We must assume he has been neutralized. A low murmur rippled through the other captains assembled in the room. Shunsui Kiyaraku, his floral pink haori draped over his shoulders, tipped his straw hat back. Foundational. That's a poet's word, not a scout's. What does it actually mean, Kenshin? It means, Kenshin replied, his gaze unwavering, that we are potentia. LLY facing a being who can command reality itself. A power that does not destroy, but unmakes. Kato's last sensory readings were not of an energy spike, but of a zone of quiet, as if the very fabric of existence was being muted. Captain Mayuri Kuratsuchi let out a soft, ecstatic hiss. Fascinating. An entity that can edit the source code of the world. The scientific possibilities are intoxicating. I must have it for study. You will have nothing, Mayuri, Yamamoto's voice boomed, his eyes snapping open. They were not the tired eyes of an old man, they were embers glowing with the heat of 1,000 years of war. The pressure in the room skyrocketed, silencing all chatter. This is not a specimen to be collected. If Captain Izanagi's report is accurate, this is a threat to the Great Wheel itself. The balance of souls, the very cycle of life, death, and reincarnation, cannot withstand such a variable. He turned his burning gaze to Kenshin. You brought this to my attention. You understand the potential gravity of the situation. What do you propose? A swift, precise, and overwhelming response, Kenshin said without hesitation. I will lead a small, elite task force into this, elemental nations. Our primary objective will be to observe and, if possible, contain the anomaly. If containment is not possible, he paused, the weight of the next word hanging in the air, we will be prepared for neutralization. This is not a task for an army. It requires speed, discretion, and the ability to combat an unconventional threat. I request authorization to select my own team. Yamamoto stared at him for a long, silent moment, the air crackling with his spiritual pressure. Then, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. Granted. You will have your team. You will have your authority. You will call this unit the Anti-Deity Task Force. Go, Captain Izanagi. Tread carefully. When one confronts a god, one must not be surprised if the ground shifts beneath one's feet. The ground in Konoha was, for the moment, perfectly solid. Sunlight streamed through the window of Naruto's apartment, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of slightly burnt rice hung in the room, a testament to Naruto's latest culinary failure. Okay, I don't get it, he said, poking at the blackened crust in the bottom of the pot. The instructions are just, add water and heat. Where's the room for error? Across the small table, Nell giggled, a bright, tinkling sound that had become the new center of Naruto's universe. She expertly picked up a piece of fish from the takeout box Jiraiya had RCI fully provided and held it out to him. Naruto, eat. In the past few weeks, a quiet, comfortable domesticity had settled over them. Nell's vocabulary was expanding daily, a collection of words picked up from Naruto and the ridiculously cheerful hosts of the children's programming he'd started leaving on for her. She was a quick study, her mind a sponge, but her favorite word remained, Naruto, often shortened to Naru. He took the piece of fish from her chopsticks, his calloused fingers brushing hers. A simple, ordinary moment that felt more real and more important than any battle he had ever fought. This was peace. This was home. He had spent his entire life chasing the dream of being acknowledged, of being important. He had never realized that the thing he truly craved was this, the quiet, easy rhythm of sharing a meal with someone who was simply happy he was there. Their days fell into a pattern. Mornings were for lessons, words, colors, the vital difference between a kunai and a kitchen knife. Afternoons, Naruto would take her to one of the more secluded training grounds on the outskirts of the village. He'd tell the Anbu guards he was practicing his chakra control. In reality, he was practicing something else entirely. While Nell chased butterflies, Naruto would sit under a tree and reach out with his senses. Gamuza was becoming less of a foreign language and more of an intuitive sense. He no longer had to concentrate so hard to see the threads of the world. They were always there, a soft, shimmering overlay on reality. He learned to listen to their songs. A healthy tree had a strong, vibrant hum. A dying leaf's song was a faint, fading whisper. He grew more ambitious in his suggestions. He would focus on a stream, not changing its course, but convincing a single droplet to leap from the water, hang suspended in the air like a tiny jewel, and then gently return to the flow. He learned to weave illusions that were not genjutsu. They weren't tricks played on the mind. They were localized, temporary edits to reality itself. He once spent an entire hour practicing with his own reflection in the water, convincing it to stand up, walk on the surface, and mirror his katas. The first time he'd succeeded, Nell had clapped her hands in delight, thinking it was the most amazing ninjutsu she had ever seen. This power was intoxicating, but it was also humbling. He was beginning to understand its terrifying scope. With enough focus, enough clarity, what were his limits? Could he convince a person their heart had stopped beating? Could he erase a mountain? The thought was a cold knot in his stomach. It was a power that required absolute control, not just of the power itself, but of his own emotions. One moment of blind rage, one surge of despair, and he would unravel everything he sought to protect. Nell, with her simple, unwavering trust in him, became his anchor. He wielded this godlike power for her, to protect the small, perfect world they were building in his tiny apartment. It was in the middle of one such peaceful afternoon that the world's music went horribly, dissonantly wrong. Naruto was sitting by the stream, watching Nell try to catch a frog, when a new sound intruded on the harmony of the forest. It was a chord of immense, crushing pressure. It was not chakra. It was something else, something vast and ancient and utterly alien. 5 distinct notes, 5 presences, appeared just outside the village walls, their spiritual weight so immense it felt like the sky was pressing down on them. Every shinobi in Konoha felt it. Alarms began to blare from the Hokage Tower. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a power that felt like a looming execution. Nell stopped, her head tilting. Her own senses, different from a ninja's, registered the newcomers. Fear flashed in her amber eyes, a primal terror that spoke of a past she couldn't remember. She scrambled back to Naruto, her small hands gripping his jacket. "Scary," she whispered, her body trembling. Naruto scooped her up, settling her on his back. "It's okay, Nell, I'm here." His voice was calm, but his heart was pounding. He could feel the threads of these new arrivals. They were sharp, disciplined, and honed like the edge of a blade. They were unlike anything he had ever encountered. He didn't wait for orders. With Nell holding on tight, he leapt into the trees, his foe a blur of orange as he raced toward the source of the pressure. He arrived at the main gate to a scene of extreme tension. Tsunade stood at the forefront, flanked by Jiraiya and Kakashi. A dozen of Konoha's best jonin were arrayed behind them, weapons drawn, their faces pale. Facing them, standing in the middle of the road, were 5 figures clad in black shihakusho and white haori. They carried swords at their waists and radiated an aura of lethal, disciplined power that made the assembled jonin look like amateurs. The one in the lead, clearly their captain, stepped forward. It was Kenshin Izanagi. His gaze was cold, analytical, and utterly focused. He scanned the Konoha forces, his eyes dismissing them as irrelevant, before his gaze swept over the village. "I am Captain Kenshin Izanagi of the Gote 13, he announced, his voice carrying with an unnatural resonance. It was not loud, but every person present heard it as if he were standing next to them. Our purpose here is not conflict. We have come under the authority of the Soul King to investigate and contain a dimensional anomaly of the highest threat level. We have come for the one known as Naruto Uzumaki. Just as he finished speaking, Naruto landed silently on the top of the gate, looking down at the newcomers. Nell peeked out from behind his shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. Kenshin's head snapped up, his eyes locked onto Naruto, and for the first time, a flicker of something, surprise, comprehension, crossed his severe features. He couldn't feel Naruto's power like he could a normal spiritual being. Instead, he felt that chilling, quiet, the subtle wrongness in the fabric of the world that his scout had reported. It was centered entirely on the blonde boy and the strange child on his back. "I'm Naruto Uzumaki," Naruto called down, his voice steady. "If you've got business with me, you've got it. But you're scaring my friend. You need to leave. Your presence threatens the stability of all worlds," Kenshin stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You will come with us. The child will be placed in protective custody. Do not resist. It will only complicate matters." Naruto's eyes narrowed. The key, et confidence he had been cultivating over the past weeks solidified into a core of unyielding iron. They wanted to take him. They wanted to take Nell. The calm he had worked so hard to build was threatened, and his protective instincts flared, hot and absolute. "No," Naruto said, the single word echoing with finality. He jumped down from the gate, landing softly on the ground between the two forces. "I'm not going anywhere, and you're not laying a hand on her." Kenshin sighed, a quiet, disappointed sound. So be it. He didn't issue a command. He didn't need to. He simply moved. In one moment, he was standing 50 feet away. In the next, he was directly in front of Naruto, his hand raised, his fingers glowing with a pale blue light. Bakudo number 61, Raikujokuro. 6 wide beams of light shot from his fingers, meant to slam into Naruto's midsection and lock him in place. It was a standard, inescapable binding spell for a target of unknown capabilities. It never connected. Naruto didn't dodge. He didn't block. He simply looked at the incoming beams of light. He saw them for what they were, threads of reishi, woven into a specific pattern to create an effect. And with a subtle mental nudge, he suggested a different pattern. Unravel. The 6 beams of light, inches from his chest, dissolved into a shower of harmless golden particles that drifted away on the breeze. Collect. I've gasp went through the Konoha shinobi. The Shinigami's eyes widened in shock. This was it. This was the foundational power they had been warned about. Kenshin's face remained a mask of calm, but his mind was racing. He had never, in 200 years of service, seen a Kido spell simply cease to exist. He immediately transitioned to his next attack, drawing his Zanpakuto in a blur of motion. The blade was a simple, elegant katana, but it shimmered with a spiritual pressure so sharp it could cut through stone as if it were air. He used Shunpo, his body flickering out of existence and reappearing directly behind Naruto. His blade aimed for a disabling cut across the shoulders. Naruto didn't even turn. As Kenshin's foot came down, Naruto looked at the ground beneath it. Be water. The solid earth gave way. Kenshin's foot plunged into the dirt as if it were a muddy puddle, his perfect form broken, his attack thrown completely off balance. He recovered instantly, leaping back, but the message was clear. The very environment was the boy's weapon. "All units, engage," Kenshin commanded, his voice cold. "Subdue. Do not kill." The other 4 Shinigami moved as one. One unleashed a torrent of fire. Another a barrage of razor-sharp wind, while 2 moved in with drawn blades. Naruto was suddenly on the defensive, Nell clinging tightly to his back. He couldn't afford to be reckless. He reached out with Gamuza, weaving a complex defense. He didn't create a shield. He convinced the incoming fire that the air in front of him was utterly devoid of oxygen, causing the flames to gutter and die. He persuaded the wind that its true path was upward, sending the blades of air harmlessly into the sky. He met the swords not with a kunai, but by making the steel of the enemy blades feel impossibly heavy for a split second, causing their wielders to stumble. He wasn't attacking. He was editing, redirecting, and neutralizing. But he was outnumbered, and the Shinigami were relentless, adapting with every move. Kenshin saw the strain on Naruto's face. The boy was powerful, but this power clearly had a cost. He was defending on too many fronts. Seeing an opening, one of the Shinigami, RN-looking woman with her hair in a tight bun, bypassed Naruto entirely. She had identified his weakness. Her hands flew through a series of seals. Bakudo number 77, Tentikura. She chanted. A massive web of spiritual energy erupted in the air, its target not Naruto, but the small, seemingly helpless child on his back. Naruto's head whipped around, his eyes wide with panic. He was tied up dealing with the other three. He couldn't stop it in time. Nell. The sight of the glowing web descending upon her, the feeling of that hostile energy targeting her, broke through the final, fractured walls of Nell's amnesia. It was a key turning in a lock rusted shut with trauma. The memory of betrayal, of a cracked mask, of a long, lonely fall into darkness, came rushing back in a tidal wave of pain and rage. A power unlike anything the Shinigami had ever felt erupted from the child's small body. It was a hurricane of green and white spiritual pressure that ripped through the air, shredding the binding spell into nothingness and blasting all 5 Shinigami backward. The light and dust were so intense that everyone was forced to shield their eyes. When it cleared, the small child was gone. In her place stood a tall, slender woman with long, flowing green hair, clad in the tattered white remnants of an Arankar uniform. A cracked, goat-like skull mask rested atop her head like a broken crown. On her back, clear as day, was a stylized tattoo of the number 3. Her amber eyes, no longer wide with childish fear, now blazed with the cold fury of a warrior. Adult Nalil had returned. She turned her furious gaze on the Shinigami who had targeted her. The woman was still struggling to her feet, her face a mask of disbelief. "You tried to hurt him." Nalil's voice was low, melodious, and filled with a deadly promise. She opened her mouth, and a ball of vibrant green energy began to condense in front of her, crackling with unimaginable power. Naruto stared, his mind reeling. "Nell, Sero," she screamed. The world turned green and white. A massive, concussive beam of energy erupted from her mouth, tearing a 10-foot-wide trench through the ground where the Shinigami had been standing. Kenshin and his subordinates had thrown themselves clear at the last second, but the sheer, raw, destructive force of the attack left them stunned and breathless. The blast had carved a path of destruction that stretched for nearly half a mile, ending in a fiery explosion on the horizon. The dust settled, revealing a scene of utter devastation. Kenshin looked from the smoldering trench back to the 2 figures standing side by side. The blonde boy who could rewrite reality, and the mysterious woman who possessed the destructive power of a small army. He raised a hand, signaling his shaken subordinates to stand down. His face was grim, his mind rapidly recalculating the parameters of his mission. Scout Kato's report had been woefully incomplete. They weren't facing a single, foundational anomaly. They were facing 2. Kenshin Izanagi, captain of the 8th Division, looked at Naruto and Nalil, and for the first time in his long, orderly life, he understood that the rules of engagement, and perhaps the rules of existence itself, had just been irrevocably broken. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. Whispers from the Void. The silence that fell over the ruined gate of Konoha was heavier than any sound. It was a vacuum, filled with the collective shock of 2 villages worth of elite warriors. The smoldering trench carved into the earth steamed in the afternoon sun, a testament to the cataclysmic power that had just been unleashed. In the center of it all stood Naruto and Nalil, back to back, a strange and terrifying island of calm in a sea of disbelief. The Shinigami stared, their disciplined composure fractured. They had come prepared for a single, esoteric anomaly. They had found a monster from their deepest history, an Arankar, and a Vasto Lord class at that, bearing the bier of a former Espada, standing beside him. For Konoha's shinobi, the shock was even more profound. They had seen the little girl who followed Naruto around like a duckling. They had dismissed her as a strange but harmless refugee. To see her transform into this goddess of destruction was to have the foundations of their reality crumble. Naruto was the first to break the stillness. He didn't look at the Shinigami or the horrified faces of his comrades. He slowly turned, his eyes wide with 1,000 questions, and looked at the woman who was, and was not, the little girl he had sworn to protect. "Nell?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. Nalil flinched, her blazing fury dimming as she turned to face him. The memories were a chaotic storm in her mind. The sting of betrayal, the cold sands of Hueco Mundo. Neutra's cruel laughter. All crashing against the warm, gentle memories of the past few weeks. The taste of ramen, the sound of Naruto's laughter, the feeling of safety in his small apartment. Her adult mind struggled to reconcile the two realities. She saw the look on his face. Not fear, not suspicion, but a deep, searching concern. He was looking for the child he knew. I am Nalil, she said. Her voice softer now, laced with confusion. But, I am also Nell. She looked down at her own hands, at her adult form, as if seeing it for the first time. I don't understand. He saw the fear returning to her eyes, the same lost look the little girl had worn. In that moment, he didn't see the former Tercera Espada. He saw his friend, terrified and adrift. He closed the small space between them and, without a second thought, reached out and gently placed his hand on her cheek. She froze at his touch, expecting him to recoil. But he didn't. His hand was warm, steady. He wasn't looking at her as a weapon or a monster. He was just looking at her. It's okay, he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in her storm. You're still you. We'll figure it out, together. A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. The warrior's mask crumbled, and the raw vulnerability of the lost child shone through. She gave a shuddering sob and nodded, her entire being seeming to sag with relief. His acceptance was the one solid piece of ground in her fractured world. Kenshin Izanagi watched this quiet, intimate exchange, and the last of his tactical certainty evaporated. His mission had been to contain a threat. But what he was witnessing was not a threat assessment, it was a character assessment. The boy's first instinct upon witnessing this terrifying transformation was not to back away, but to offer comfort. The foundational power he wielded was tempered by a foundational empathy. This changed everything. Stand down, Kenshin ordered his team, sheathing his Zanpakuto. The gesture was deliberate, a clear signal of de-escalation. He took a step forward, his hands held open. Tsunade Dono, he said, his voice formal as he addressed the Hokage. It is clear we have all misjudged the situation. I believe a discussion is in order. Tsunade, her face a grim mask, gave a curt nod. The immediate danger had passed, but 1,000 new questions had taken its place. Before another word could be spoken, a new feeling washed over them. It was not a spiritual pressure. It was not chakra. It was a universal drop in temperature, a sudden, chilling silence that fell not just on the valley, but on the entire world. The birds stopped singing. The wind died. The hum of the world's threads, which only Naruto could hear, faded into a terrifying, flat drone, like a song that had lost its melody. Every head, Shinigami and shinobi alike, turned to the east. A shadow had fallen over the land, even though the sun was high and the sky was cloudless. It was a wrongness, a creeping dread that prickled the skin and raised the hairs on the back of the neck. What is that? Kakashi asked, his Sharingan eye wide and spinning, trying to process a phenomenon that had no chakra, no physical form. Naruto felt it most acutely. Through his Gamuza, he could perceive the change on a fundamental level. The threads of reality in that direction were not being attacked or destroyed. They were vanishing. They were being systematically and silently erased, like a flaw being snipped from a tapestry by an unseen hand. There was a village there, Tsunade said, her voice tight with alarm. Sumatai, a small farming settlement about 30 miles from here. There was, Jiraiya repeated, his expression grim. Without another word, Naruto moved. He scooped Nalil into his arms in a bridal carry, ignoring her startled yelp. Hold on, he said, and then he was gone, a blur of motion heading east. He's heading for the village. A Jonin shouted. Kenshin didn't hesitate. Follow him, he commanded his team. With a series of shunpo, the 5 Shinigami vanished. Tsunade cursed, then barked orders. In seconds, the clearing was empty, save for the deep, smoldering scar in the earth. A forgotten prelude to a much greater horror. The journey was a race against a silent, encroaching dread. Naruto ran, his feet barely touching the ground, his mind reeling. The drone in his senses grew louder the closer he got. A sound of absolute nothingness that grated on his soul. Nalil, held tight against his chest, could feel the wrongness too. It was a cold that her Arankar Hierro, her spiritual armor, could not block. They broke through the tree line and stopped dead. Before them was not a ruined village. There were no flames, no rubble, no craters. There was nothing. It was a perfect, hemispherical void. A 3-mile-wide bite had been taken out of the world. The edge was unnervingly clean, cutting through the forest and the earth with geometric precision. A tree on the border was sheared in half, its remaining section perfectly healthy, while the other half was simply gone. The very air inside the void seemed different, darker, stiller. No light reflected from its depths. No sound escaped it. It was a patch of non-existence, a cancer of silence that had been carved into the living skin of the world. The Shinigami appeared a moment later, landing silently behind Naruto. Their faces, usually composed and stoic, were masks of absolute horror. Even Mayuri Kuretsuchi would have found no scientific fascination in this, only a terrifying, sterile finality. "By the Soul King," one of Kenshin's lieutenants whispered, his voice trembling. "What is this? What could do this?" Kenshin stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, a useless gesture against an enemy that left nothing to cut. "This is not destruction," he said, his voice hollow with awe and terror. "This is erasure." The Konoha shinobi arrived, skidding to a halt at the edge of the void. Their faces mirroring the same horrified disbelief. They had come prepared for a fight, for a disaster. They had no frame of reference for this. This was not war. This was decreation. Naruto hand. Eda shaken Nalil to Jiraiya and walked to the very edge of the abyss. He knelt, his hand hovering over the border. On one side, he could feel the vibrant, complex threads of the world, the life of the soil, the memory of the wind. On the other, nothing. A complete and total absence. The threads of reality simply stopped, snipped clean. As he stared into that silent, perfect darkness, a new sound entered his mind. It was not a voice that traveled through the air. It was a thought, carried on the fundamental hum of Gamuza, a message transmitted directly through the source code of reality. As a voice as calm and gentle as falling snow, yet older than the stars, and filled with a weariness so profound it felt like the universe itself was sighing. "Can you feel it, little weaver?" Naruto flinched, his head snapping up as he looked around, but there was no one there. The voice was inside his head, a whisper from the void itself. The silence, the peace. "For a million millennia, I have watched the threads of existence twist and snarl. I have seen them weave symphonies of impossible beauty, and I have seen them knot into tapestries of unending agony. Life, consciousness, it is a flaw in the grand design. A fever that causes the universe to dream of pain, and loss, and fear." Naruto felt a pressure against his mind, not an attack, but an offering. He was shown images, feelings, woven directly into his perception. He felt the terror of a soul being devoured by a hollow. He felt the grief of a mother losing her child to war. He felt the endless, lonely cycle of birth and death, a wheel of suffering turning for eternity. "I offer a cure," the voice continued, its tone one of infinite, sorrowful compassion. "A mercy. I do not destroy. I unmake. I gently snip the threads and return them to the perfect, silent void from which they came. The state of true peace. No suffering, no fear, only the quiet harmony of non-existence. This is not an act of hatred, little weaver. It is an act of ultimate love." "Who are you?" Naruto breathed, the words barely making a sound. "I am the one who came before," the voice whispered, a hint of ancient tragedy in its tone. "You may call me Malachor, the weaver of silence. Join me. Your power is like my own. Together, we can finally heal the universe of its greatest affliction, the affliction of being. We can bring peace to everyone." The voice faded, and the oppressive, unnatural stillness over the land lifted. The wind began to blow again, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The birds, cautiously, began to sing. But the hole in the world remained, a stark, silent testament to the horror that had just occurred. Naruto pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling, his face pale. He turned to face the others. They had not heard the voice, but they saw the effect it had on him. They saw the look in his eyes, the look of a man who had just stared into the abyss and found the abyss staring calmly back. "He called it a mercy," Naruto whispered, his voice hoarse. "He thinks he's saving us." Kenshin stepped forward, his expression harder and more determined than ever before. He looked at Naruto, then at the void, then back to Naruto. His mission was no longer relevant. His orders were meaningless. There was only one thing that mattered now. Hokage Dono, Kenshin said, turning to Tsunade, his voice ringing with a new, grim purpose. I am formally requesting a temporary cessation of hostilities. My mandate from the Seraite was to contain an unknown threat to the balance. I have found it, and it is not Naruto Uzumaki. He turned his gaze fully on Naruto, a look of grudging respect in his eyes. In fact, his power may be the only thing in any of our worlds that can even comprehend what we are facing. We are no longer Shinigami and Shinobi. We are simply soldiers standing on the edge of oblivion. Tsunade looked at the hole in her country, at the faces of her terrified ninja, and at the boy who had become something more than human. The choice was not a choice at all. The truce is granted, she said, her voice heavy. God help us all. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. A Memory of Green. The return to Konoha was a silent, grim procession. No one spoke. There were no words for what they had seen. The geometric perfection of the void, the chilling silence where a village had once stood, was a memory burned onto the inside of their eyelids. It was a wound in the world, and they were the helpless witnesses to its creation. A tense, unspoken truce had formed out of shared terror. Kenshin Izanagi and his Shinigami moved with the Konoha shinobi, their former animosity replaced by a heavy, pragmatic understanding. They were all insects living on a leaf that a careless god had decided to prune. Tsunade, her face aged a decade in a single afternoon, immediately converted a strategic war room beneath the Hokage Tower into a joint command center. Maps were unrolled, communication seals were activated, and scouts were sent out, not to find an enemy, but to search for more holes in their reality. The atmosphere was thick with a fear more corrosive than any threat of invasion, because this enemy could not be fought with kunai and jutsu. How do you fight an enemy whose very presence is an absence? In the midst of this organized chaos, Naruto's world had shrunk to the size of a single, trembling individual. Nalil had not reverted to her child form upon their return. She remained in her adult body, but the fiery warrior who had unleashed Tesero of devastating power was gone. In her place was a ghost. She moved through Naruto's apartment with a silent, haunted grace, her amber eyes staring at things that were not there. She would flinch at shadows, her hands flying up to the cracked mask on her head as if to ward off a phantom blow. The memories, unlocked by the Shinigami's attack, were now a torrent she could not control. They played in a looping, agonizing reel behind her eyes, the desolate white sands of Hueco Mundo. The condescending smirk of Neutra Gilga, the searing pain of his blade striking her from behind, the sickening crack of her mask, the long, terrifying fall into amnesia and infancy. Naruto watched her, his heart a tight, aching knot in his chest. He tried to talk to her, to offer her food, to coax her into resting, but she seemed to look straight through him. She was trapped in the prison of her own past, and he had no key. He could feel the threads of her existence with his Gamuza. They were a chaotic, flickering storm of emerald green and white, lashing out with spikes of raw, uncontrolled spiritual energy. Her pain was so immense it had a physical presence in the room, a low, keening hum that only he could perceive. On the second night, the storm broke. Naruto was jolted from a light, restless sleep on his futon by a sudden, violent surge of pressure that rattled the windows. He shot up, his eyes immediately going to his bed where Nalil lay. She was thrashing, tangled in the sheets, a low moan escaping her lips. Green spiritual energy, her Ryutsu, was leaking from her uncontrollably, crackling in the air like static electricity. Objects in the room began to vibrate. A cup on his nightstand shattered. Nell, he yelled, rushing to her side. He reached out to touch her shoulder, and the moment his fingers made contact, an image, a feeling, flooded his mind. He saw through her eyes. He was standing on white sand under a false moon. A towering, skeletal figure with a cruel grin and a weapon like a twisted crescent moon loomed over him. You're pathetic, Nalil, the figure sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Warriors don't need reason. They just need power. Something you've lost. The vision was so vivid, so filled with her terror and despair. Naruto recoiled as if he had been physically struck. He realized what was happening. She was trapped in a nightmare, reliving the moment of her betrayal. Her subconscious was lashing out, her immense, Power untethered from her conscious will. If he didn't do something, she could level the entire apartment complex without even waking up. The Anbu guards stationed outside would be here in seconds. They would see this display of uncontrolled power not as a symptom of trauma, but as an attack. They would try to subdue her, and in her current state, she would kill them without knowing what she was doing. He had to act. Now, his first instinct was to fight, to use Gamuza to suppress her Ryutsu, to force a calm upon her. But as he looked at her tormented face, he knew that would be a violation. It would be the same as Neutra's blade, another force imposing its will upon her. He couldn't heal a wound by creating a new one. He had to go to her. Not with power, but with presence. He closed his eyes, shutting out the vibrating room and the crackling green energy. He reached out with Gamuza, not to the threads of the room, but to the chaotic, stormy threads of Nalil's own being. He didn't try to still them. He just listened. He listened to the story of her pain, the sharp, jagged notes of betrayal, the long, sorrowful hum of loneliness. And within that storm, he found a single, quiet thread. It was a memory, deep and constant, the one unchanging thing in her long, lonely existence as an Arankar. It was the memory of the sky. The stark, black, moonlit sky of Hueco Mundo. It was a lonely sight, but it was hers. It was her home. He took hold of that thread, gently, reverently. He didn't pull. He didn't change it. He amplified it. He focused his entire will, his entire being, on that single thread. He poured his own calm into it, his own unwavering belief that she was safe with him. He presented a new reality, not to the room, but to her dreaming mind. You are not there on the sands of betrayal. You are here. You are safe. Look up. The change was subtle, then absolute. The violent green energy crackling in the room did not vanish, it was drawn inward. The rattling of the furniture stopped. The oppressive spiritual pressure receded, coalescing around the bed. Slowly, the walls of Naruto's small, cluttered apartment began to fade, not disappearing, but dissolving into a soft, inky blackness. The ceiling vanished, replaced by a vast, starless night sky, dominated by a stark, stationary moon. The floor beneath his feet softened, becoming fine, cool, white sand. The air grew still and quiet, carrying no scent, no sound. They were no longer in his apartment. They were in a memory. A pocket of reality he had woven for her from the threads of her own mind, insulated and safe. Nalil's thrashing stopped. She lay still in the center of this dreamscape, her breathing still ragged. Naruto walked to her side, his feet making no sound on the sand. He sat down beside her, not touching her, just being there. A silent guardian in her lonely world. Her eyes slowly opened, but they weren't her waking eyes. They were the eyes of her soul, looking out into the dream. She saw him sitting there, a splash of warm, vibrant orange in the stark black and white of her oldest memory. Naruto, she whispered, her voice the voice of Nalil, filled with a weary disbelief. I'm here, he said softly. It's just a bad dream. She looked around at the perfect, silent recreation of Hueco Mundo's sky. This place, I hate this place. I know, he said. He didn't tell her it wasn't real. He didn't tell her everything would be okay. They were hollow words that would mean nothing to a pain this deep. Instead, he just sat with her in her hatred, in her memory, sharing the burden of it. She sat up, wrapping her arms around her knees. He was my friend, she whispered, the words choked with a grief centuries old. Peshi, Dondochaka, we were a family. He was my subordinate, Neutra. I saved his life. And he did this to me. For pride. Because he couldn't stand that a woman was stronger than him. Naruto listened, his heart aching for her. He could feel the truth of her words. The jagged edges of her broken trust. To be strong, she continued, her gaze lost in the false moon, you must have a reason. A purpose. Something to protect. I tried to teach him that. But he only understood power for its own sake. He thought my heart was a weakness. She turned her gaze to Naruto, her amber eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He was wrong, wasn't he? He was wrong, Naruto confirmed, his voice firm with a certainty that cut through the silence. Your heart is the strongest thing about you. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the quiet between them more comforting than any words could be. In this shared space, Stripped of pretense and distraction, a new connection was woven between them. He saw the incredible strength it took for her to maintain her passion in a world designed to crush it. And she saw in him a boy who had been given every reason to hate the world, but had stubbornly chosen to protect it instead. They were two sides of the same coin. Two lonely souls who had refused to let their pain define them. It was more than friendship. It was a profound, unspoken recognition. A feeling of coming home. As the first hints of the real dawn began to filter through the window of his apartment, the dreamscape started to fade. The black sky softened to gray, the white sands becoming the simple fabric of his bedsheets. Nalil's eyelids grew heavy. "Naruto," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "Thank you. Always, Nell," he whispered back. She lay back down, and as she drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep for the first time in days, her form shimmered. With a soft sigh, she shrank, her adult body receding, the green hair shortening, the tattered Arankar uniform melting away to be replaced by the simple, oversized shirt she had been wearing. The small, child form of Nell snuggled into the blankets, her face relaxed and free of fear. Naruto watched her, a small smile on his face. He hadn't healed her, he had just held the darkness at bay long enough for her to find her own peace. The experience had left him utterly drained, the delicate, sustained use of Gamuza a far greater strain than any battle. But it was a good kind of tired. A purposeful tired. He was about to settle back onto his futon when there was a sharp rap on his door. He opened it to find Jiraiya, his face etched with a gravity that instantly put Naruto on high alert. "They're gone," Jiraiya said, his voice low and urgent. "The Anbu guards Danzo assigned to you. They were recalled an hour ago." At the same time, an emergency council meeting was convened. Danzo is using the erasure of Sumatai, and the presence of the Shinigami, as proof of Tsunade's failed leadership. Naruto's exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold dread. He had been so focused on Nell's inner storm that he hadn't seen the political one brewing right outside his door. "He's painting you and the Shinigami as the cause of the disaster," Jiraiya continued, his eyes grim. "He's arguing that Tsunade's alliance is reckless, that your unstable power is a magnet for these otherworldly threats. He's proposing a motion of no confidence. He's making a move for the hat, Naruto. Right now." Chapter 5 End. Chapter 6. The Unraveling City. The sterile, oppressive air of the Seraite's central 46 chambers hummed with a tension so thick it felt like unsheathed steel. 40 ancient, aristocratic figures, their faces hidden behind slatted screens, sat in judgment. They were the law, the absolute authority of the Soul Society, and their collective gaze was fixed on the lone figure kneeling in the center of the vast, cold hall. Captain Kenshin Izanagi did not fidget. He did not waver. He knelt with the stillness of a statue, his haori pooled around him, his hands resting on his thighs. He had been in this position for 2 hours, recounting every detail of his mission, every observation, every impossible event. He spoke of the foundational power of the boy, Naruto Uzumaki. He spoke of the sudden, shocking appearance of the former Tercera Espada. He spoke of the void, the patch of uncreation where a village had once stood. And he spoke of the voice from the abyss, the entity called Malachor. When he finished, a cold, patrician voice echoed from behind one of the screens. "Captain Izanagi, you were dispatched to contain a threat. Instead, you entered into an unsanctioned truce with foreign powers and now return with a tale of a nihilistic god who erases reality. A convenient, if imaginative, explanation for the loss of your scout and the failure of your mission." "It is not an explanation. It is a fact," Kenshin stated, his voice calm but edged with an iron certainty that bordered on insubordination. "Our own Department of Research and Development has confirmed a catastrophic loss of souls in the Rukongai districts bordering the Dongai. Not killed, not purified. Simply gone. Vanished from the cycle of reincarnation. This is Malachor's work. He is not targeting one world. He is targeting all of them." "An unsubstantiated claim," another voice countered. "Captain Kuretsuchi's preliminary report suggests the phenomenon could be a new, previously unobserved form of mass soul suicide. Your judgment, Captain Izanagi, appears to have been compromised by exposure to this anomaly, known as Naruto Uzumaki. You have forgotten your duty." Kenshin's jaw tightened. My duty is to protect the Soul Society. Naruto Uzumaki is not the enemy. He may be our only hope of understanding, and perhaps combating, this threat. Hope, the first voice sneered. He is an aberration, a mortal wielding a power that mocks the very structure of our world. You propose an alliance with the unknown, a violation of 1,000 years of law and tradition. Unacceptable. Your anti-deity task force is hereby disbanded. You are confined to your barracks pending a full review of your conduct. The Gote 13 will handle this threat as we always have, with our own strength. Kenshin bowed his head, a gesture of submission that masked a seething frustration. As you command. He knew it was useless to argue. The Central 46 were not swayed by evidence, they were bound by dogma. To them, a new problem was simply an old problem in a different guise, to be met with the same old solutions. He rose and walked from the chamber, his steps echoing in the vast, cold space. They were blind. They were shackled by their own arrogance, unable to comprehend a threat that their swords could not cut and their Kido could not bind. They would send squads of Shinigami into the silent, unraveling districts of the Rukongai. And those squads would simply vanish. They would be throwing pebbles at a tidal wave of nothingness. He had to get a message to Konoha. He had to warn them. The truce was over. The Gote 13 was now, officially, a hostile force, and Malachor was continuing his silent, inexorable advance. The air in Tsunade's office was just as tense, but it was a hot, simmering tension, not a cold, dogmatic one. Naruto stood beside the Hokage's desk, with Jiraiya on her other side. Across from them stood Danzo Shimura, flanked by two of his blank-masked Root Anbu. Homura and Kaharu, the village elders, sat to one side, their faces unreadable masks of deliberation. The facts are undeniable, Danzo said, his one visible eye cold and hard. Under Tsunade's leadership, this village has suffered a catastrophic failure in the retrieval of the Uchiha, harbored an unstable Jinchuriki whose powers are clearly out of his control, and forged a reckless alliance with otherworldly invaders. This has culminated in an attack on our very soil by an unknown entity, resulting in the complete annihilation of a Konoha settlement. He gestured toward Naruto. This boy is a magnet for chaos. His very existence is a threat. Tsunade's sentimentality and weakness in dealing with him has endangered us all. That's a lie. Naruto shot back, his fists clenched. Malachor isn't attacking because of me. He's attacking everyone. And who is this, Malachor? Kaharu asked, her voice thin and skeptical. We have only your word for his existence. A voice in your head. It sounds more like the whispers of a demon than a credible threat. The Shinigami believe him, Tsunade countered, her voice a low growl. Captain Izanagi saw the same evidence we did. Our alliance is a strategic necessity. An alliance that is already over. Danzo said smoothly, dropping a scroll onto the desk. Our long-range sensors detected 5 spiritual pressures departing our lands less than an hour ago. Your allies have abandoned you, Tsunade. They have left us to face this oblivion, alone. Your gamble has failed. Naruto's stomach dropped. Kenshin had left, without a word. It didn't make sense. The Agami captain was stern and uncompromising, but he was a man of honor. He wouldn't just run. Something must have forced his hand. This is not a failure of strategy, Jiraiya interjected, his usual joviality gone. Replaced by a grim seriousness. It is the dawn of a new era. The old rules no longer apply. Danzo, your obsession with control and secrecy is a relic of a bygone age. We cannot hide from this threat. We can excise it, Danzo retorted, his cold gaze locking onto Naruto. The Jinchuriki must be contained. Placed under the direct authority of the Foundation, where his power can be studied, controlled, and if necessary, sealed away for the good of the village. Absolutely not. Tsunade slammed her fist on the table, the wood groaning in protest. I will not hand over one of my shinobi to be your personal lab rat. He is not a shinobi. He is a weapon. Danzo's voice rose, his cold composure finally cracking to reveal the fanaticism beneath. A weapon you have allowed to rust and think for itself. This is the moment of decision. The council must choose. My path of strength and security, or Tsunade's path of sentimentality and ruin. The two elders exchanged a long, meaningful look. The silence stretched, thick with consequence. Finally, Homura spoke, his voice heavy with reluctant resolve. Danzo is right about one thing. The situation is untenable. A decision must be made for the stability of the village. We will put it to a formal vote. It was a coup. A bloodless, procedural coup, but a coup nonetheless. Naruto watched, his mind reeling. He had spent the last few weeks learning to command reality. But in this room, he was powerless. This wasn't a battle of jutsu or power, but of influence and fear. Danzo wasn't fighting with weapons, he was fighting with words, twisting the truth into a shape that served his ambition. Suddenly, Naruto felt it. A cold, familiar wrongness. A silent chord of dread that resonated deep in his soul. He turned his head, his gaze unfocused, looking through the walls of the tower, eastward. "He's here," Naruto whispered, his voice barely audible. "What are you talking about, boy?" Danzo snapped. "Malachor," Naruto said, his EY's widening in horror as his Gamuza sense showed him the unfolding catastrophe. "He's not erasing the edge of the world this time. He's in the Seraite. He's unraveling it from the inside out." The 78th district of the Rukongai, known as Inzuri, or the Hanging Slums, was a place of last resort. It was a chaotic, sprawling city of rickety shacks and desperate souls, the farthest reach of the Soul Society's influence. It was also the perfect target. Malachor's attack was not a fiery assault. It was a creeping, silent plague. It started at the district's center. A single resident, a soul, who had spent a century in abject poverty, simply ceased. One moment, he was sitting on his porch. The next, the porch, and the ground beneath it were gone, replaced by a patch of perfect, silent nothingness. From this epicenter, the erasure spread. It didn't move like a wave of destruction. It moved like a disease, hopping from one point to another. A marketplace would be bustling with activity, and then a stall, its owner. And all its customers would vanish in the blink of an eye, leaving another circular patch of void. The panic was slow to start, because there was no sound, no explosion. People would simply turn to talk to a neighbor and find an empty space where their friend had been standing. By the time the Seraite alarms began to scream, dozens of these silent voids had appeared. Growing and merging like cells dividing and consuming the host. Chaos erupted. Souls scrambled to flee, their terror creating a stampede, but there was nowhere to run. The erasure was not just spreading outward. It was appearing randomly throughout the entire district. The first squads of Shinigami arrived to a scene of nightmarish confusion. They could see the voids, the pockets of nothingness eating their world. But there was no enemy to fight. They raised their blades against an absence. Then, they too began to vanish. A lieutenant would be shouting orders, and halfway through a word, he would be gone. His voice cut off into absolute silence. His squad would stare in horror at the empty space where he had been, and then one of them would vanish as well. This was Malachor's new strategy. He wasn't just erasing the world. He was erasing the memory and morale of those who defended it. He was a force of entropy, a creeping, inevitable decay. From his now compromised barracks, Ken's Hinazanagi felt the waves of panic and the sudden, silent extinguishing of dozens of Shinigami life signatures. The Central 46 had been deliberating for hours. By the time they decided on a course of action, there would be nothing left of the outer districts. He was a prisoner of fools while his world was being unmade. He had one last, desperate gambit. A forbidden Kido, a communication spell that could punch a hole through dimensions. But at a terrible cost to the caster. It would drain him, leave him vulnerable, but it was the only way. He had to warn Naruto. He had to tell him what was happening. He had to ask for help. It was an admission of failure, a plea to an entity his government had just declared an enemy, but pride had no place at the end of the world. He sealed the doors to his room, painted a complex array on the floor with his own blood, and began the chant. In the Hokage's office, the political maneuvering came to a screeching halt. Naruto's words, his genuine, soul-deep terror, had silenced the room. He stumbled back, his hand pressed to his head, his face pale with the effort of perceiving an event happening a world away. "He's erasing the souls," Naruto gasped, trying to translate the horrific data his senses were feeding him. Thousands of them. They're just gone. The Shinigami. They're trying to fight, but they're disappearing too. Kenshin. He's trying to reach me. Danzo stared, his one eye wide, a sliver of disbelief warring with the undeniable terror on Naruto's face. Impossible. You can't possibly know that. He's asking for help, Naruto said, his gaze locking with Tsunade's. It was a desperate, pleading look. They were wrong. They can't stop him. He's going to unmake their entire world, and then he's coming back for ours. The fate of two worlds hung in the balance. Not on a battlefield, but in this single, tense room. Tsunade looked at Danzo's rigid ambition, at the elders' fearful indecision, and then at Naruto's desperate certainty. She had been a gambler her entire life. She had always bet on the long shot. Jiraiya, she snapped, her voice ringing with the absolute authority of the Hokage. Get Kakashi. Get Guy. Assemble a team of our fastest. We're going to the Soul Society. Tsunade, this is madness. Danzo bellowed. You would lead our forces into another dimension on the word of this unstable. Silence. Tsunade roared, a wave of her chakra flaring, cracking the very walls of the room. She turned her furious, burning gaze on Danzo. You speak of strength, Danzo. But all you see are enemies. At the village gates, inside our walls, in your own ranks, your path isn't strength, it's fear. And fear has no place in the leader of this village. She turned to Naruto. You have my full authority. We are no longer debating. We are acting. Get your friend. We leave in 10 minutes. Naruto didn't need to be told twice. He was gone in a flicker of movement, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The coup was over. Debate had been rendered meaningless by the sheer, overwhelming scale of the crisis. There was no more Konoha politics. There was only the war against the silent, encroaching void. Chapter 6 End. Chapter 7. The God and the King. The air in the designated staging area, Training Ground 7, crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with jutsu. It was the frantic, high-strung thrum of a world holding its breath. 10 minutes. Tsunade had given them 10 minutes to prepare for a journey into another dimension to fight a god of nothingness. Kakashi was already there, his single eye sharp and focused, a pack of supplies on his back. Might Guy arrived in a blur of green, his usual boisterous energy tempered by a grim, razor-sharp intensity. Jiraiya stood beside Tsunade, the two of them in a low, urgent conversation about how to even begin such a task. Naruto appeared a moment later, a small, green-haired child holding his hand. Nell was quiet, her small face serious. The transformation had changed her. She was still a child in form, but her amber eyes held the ancient, weary wisdom of Nalil. The barrier between her two selves had thinned to a veil. She knew who she was, and she knew what was coming. She's coming with you, Tsunade asked, her brow furrowed with concern. I'm not leaving her behind, Naruto said, his tone absolute. He looked down at Nell, who squeezed his hand. I fight, Nell said, her voice small but firm. For Naruto, a portal. They needed a portal. Jiraiya's reverse summoning was the closest equivalent, but it was designed to pull someone from a contracted location. Not to punch a blind hole into another reality. Kenshin is the key, Naruto said, his eyes closed in concentration as he reached out with Gamuza. He's using a Kido spell. It's like a flare, a beacon of spiritual energy. It's faint, but it's there. It's a pinprick of light in the darkness. He looked at Jiraiya. Can you aim for that? Aiming is one thing, Naruto. Tearing a hole in the fabric between worlds is another. Jiraiya said grimly. The barrier is resilient. It would take a catastrophic amount of chakra to force it open. Then we won't force it, Naruto replied, a strange calm settling over him. He was beginning to understand the nature of his power. It wasn't about force. It was about persuasion. Don't try to break the door down. Just ask it to open. He placed his hand on Jiraiya's shoulder. Get ready. Jiraiya slammed his blood-smeared palm on the ground, channeling an immense amount of chakra into the summoning array. Reverse summoning jutsu. As the sage's chakra surged, trying to brute force a pathway, Naruto reached out with Gamuza. He didn't focus on the chakra. He focused on the space between the worlds, the dimensional fabric itself. He saw it as a tightly woven tapestry. Dense and impenetrable. He didn't try to rip the threads. He found the seams. He located the point where Kenshin's beacon was straining the fabric and he gently loosened the weave. He suggested to the universe that right here, right now, the distance between Konoha and the Seraite was not a barrier, but a doorway. For a moment, nothing happened. Jiraiya grunted with effort, sweat pouring down his face. Then, the air in front of them shimmered. It did not tear or explode. It simply parted, like a curtain being drawn aside, revealing a swirling vortex of chaotic color and screaming light. It's unstable, Kakashi yelled over the roaring sound. It won't hold. It doesn't have to hold forever, Tsunade shouted. Just for a few seconds. Go, now. There were no grand farewells. Guy gave a sharp nod. Kakashi raised a hand, and Jiraiya gave his student a look of fierce, desperate pride. Then, one by one, they leapt into the breach. Naruto went last, holding Nell tight against his chest. The moment his feet left the ground of Konoha, the doorway behind him sealed shut, leaving nothing but the scent of ozone and the quiet hum of an ordinary afternoon. The journey was a violent, disorienting nightmare. They were tumbling through a space that was not a space, a torrent of raw, conceptual energy. It was the universe's circulatory system, the raw code of existence flowing between worlds. Without Naruto's influence, it would have torn them apart, atom by atom. He wrapped them in a bubble of coherent reality, a tiny, fragile island of, is in an ocean of, could be. He held the threads of their existence together by sheer force of will, anchoring them to the faint, distant beacon of Kenshin's Kido. They burst out of the vortex not with a step, but with a violent expulsion. Tumbling onto the cobblestones of a street that was actively coming undone. They had arrived in the heart of the Inzuri district, and it was a scene from a madman's dream. The chaos was terrifyingly silent. Buildings were not collapsing. They were being scooped out of existence, leaving behind perfect, void black craters. Panicked souls ran screaming through the streets, their cries cut short as they, or the ground beneath their feet, simply vanished. In the center of the district, hovering a few feet above the ground, was the source. The Herald. It had no shape, no form. It was a shimmering distortion in the air, a human-sized patch of reality that seemed to be actively erasing itself. Looking at it was like looking at a glitch in the world, a hole through which the darkness of the void was leaking. It did not radiate power, it radiated absence. Its very presence was anathema to existence. What in the hells is that thing? Guy shouted, his body already glowing with the faint green aura of the third gate. That's him, Naruto said, his voice grim. That's Malicor's echo. Before a plan could be formed, the herald turned its faceless presence toward them. A nearby bell tower, a massive stone structure that had stood for 500 years, simply ceased to be, vanishing without a sound to make way for the herald's line of sight. No time to think. Jiraiya roared, his hands already a blur of signs. Fire style. Giant flame bomb. A massive fireball, 10 feet in diameter, roared toward the herald. It didn't impact. It didn't explode. The moment the aims touched the herald's zone of influence, they were unmade, their heat and light extinguished as if they had never been kindled. Kakashi moved next, his hand crackling with the sound of 1,000 birds. Reikiri. He shot forward, aiming to pierce the center of the distortion. Like the fireball, the lightning blade of raw chakra dissolved into nothingness inches from its target. Kakashi was foe, RCED to twist in midair to avoid flying directly into the void himself. The herald didn't counterattack. It didn't need to. It simply was. And its being was erasure. A section of the street beneath Guy's feet vanished, forcing the taijutsu master to leap backward. It is untouchable, Guy yelled in frustration. Our attacks do not even register. This was a battle they could not win with force. It was a conceptual problem. Naruto, a small voice said from beside him. Nell looked up at him, her childish form shimmering with a rising tide of green light. He holds it. I hit it. Naruto understood instantly. A perfect, unspoken strategy born of their unique connection. The herald was unmaking reality, but it was still bound by the rules of reality. It had a location. It had a presence. If he could use Gamuza to reinforce those rules, to make them absolute, he could hold it in place. He could make it a target. Get ready, he said to her, a fierce grin spreading across his face. It was the first time he had felt the thrill of a real fight since awakening his power. Let's show them how it's done. The world of threads flared to life in Naruto's vision. He ignored the herald itself. Its threads were a tangle of negatives. A knot of is not that he couldn't grasp. Instead, he focused on everything around it. The ground, the air, the very space it occupied. Now, he yelled. He slammed his palms on the cobblestones. He wasn't channeling chakra. He was issuing a command. This ground is immutable. This stone is the memory of the mountain. It will not yield. The threads of the ear. Beneath the herald glowed with a brilliant, golden light, their existence reinforced, made, more real. The herald's passive erasure flickered, its spread momentarily halted as it encountered this patch of stubborn, unyielding reality. At the same instant, Nell exploded in a column of green light. Her small body stretched, matured, the Tercera Espada returning in all her glory. "Declare," she whispered, her voice a low, dangerous hum. Gamuza. Her resurrection was a startling, beautiful transformation. Her body was clad in a form-fitting white armor, and from her back sprouted the powerful legs and armored carapace of a centaur-like creature. In her hands, a long, double-ended lance of green, spiritual energy materialized. The name of her release, a staggering coincidence that spoke of a deeper connection between their worlds, echoed in Naruto's mind. She was the Ibex Knight. The king. The herald seemed to sense the shift. The aura of nothingness around it intensified as it tried to erase the ground Naruto was reinforcing. "It won't work," Naruto shouted, his focus absolute. He reached out and grabbed the threads of the air itself, weaving them into a cage. "This space is a prison. Its walls are the concept of here, and its bars are the concept of now. You will not leave." The air around the herald solidified, not into a physical barrier, but into a conceptual one. The distortion wavered, visibly straining against the absolute nature of Naruto's declarations. He was pinning a ghost to the wall using the nails of reality itself. "Nalil," he roared. She was already moving. She charged, her armored hooves not even touching the ground, propelled by pure spiritual power. Her lance crackled, aimed at the heart of the distortion Naruto was holding in place. This was not a subtle attack. This was the application of overwhelming, impossible force. This was the power of a vasto lord, a king of souls, focused into a single point. Cerro doble. She didn't fire a cerro from her mouth. She fired one from the tip of her lance, a concentrated beam of destructive green energy. At the same time, she opened her mouth and swallowed the herald's own aura of erasure. In a terrifying display of power, she absorbed her enemy's attack and, in the same breath, fired it back, weaving it into her own cerro. The resulting blast was not green. It was a blinding, world-shattering torrent of pure white energy. A fusion of creation and anti-creation. It struck the herald, which was still pinned by Naruto's Gamuza, and for the first time, the entity was overwhelmed. There was no explosion. There was an implosion. The white light of Nalil's attack, and the dark void of the herald, collapsed in on themselves, creating a silent, violent flash that sucked in the air, the light, and the sound around it. When their vision returned, the herald was gone. The unnatural voids in the district stopped spreading. The silent erasure had ended. Naruto fell to one knee, panting, the strain of holding reality together by sheer will having taken a massive toll. Nalil landed gracefully beside him, her resurrection fading, returning her to her Arankar form. They had done it. They had won. Jiraiya, Kakashi, and Guy could only stare, their minds struggling to comprehend the battle they had just witnessed. It was a fight on a level they had never imagined, a duet of reality warping and soul-crushing power. But their victory was a fleeting breath in a gathering storm. The air grew cold again. A presence descended upon the ruined district, a consciousness so vast and ancient it made Herald feel like a candle flame next to a sun. A figure began to coalesce in the sky above them. It was not a projection. It felt as if the universe itself was weaving him into existence. He was tall and unnervingly serene, clad in simple, flowing black robes. His hair was the white of bleached bone, and his eyes were black holes, voids that held no light, only an ancient, tired sadness. It was Malachor. He looked down, his gaze passing over the Shinigami who were now emerging from the rubble, over the Konoha shinobi, and settling on Naruto and Nalil. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet, academic curiosity. Incredible, Malachor's voice echoed, not in their ears, but in their minds. to reinforce reality against the tide of its own unmaking, and to overwhelm erasure with pure, passionate force. You are the two most beautiful, most tragic flaws I have ever witnessed. He addressed Naruto directly. You are a weaver, like me. You feel the song of existence. Can you not feel how much of it is out of tune? How much of it is pain? I offer you a legacy. A purpose beyond these petty struggles. Stand with me. Help me bring the silence. Help me grant the mercy of the void to all who suffer. Naruto pushed himself to his feet, standing shoulder to shoulder with Nalil. He looked at her, at the fierce loyalty in her eyes. He looked at his friends, battered but resolute. He thought of his village, of the simple joy of sharing ramen with a friend, of the chaotic, vibrant, imperfect tapestry of life. He met Malicor's empty gaze without fear. You call it mercy, Naruto said, his voice ringing with a conviction that pushed back against the god's oppressive presence. But a world without pain is a world without joy. A world without struggle is a world without strength. You're not a savior. You're just a coward, too scared to live in the world you were given. He held up his fist. We'll take the pain. We'll take the struggle. We'll take the joy, and the love, and the loss. We'll take all of it. Because that's what it means to be alive. And we will never, ever let you take that away from us. Malicor's serene expression did not change, but a profound sadness filled his voice. So be it. A flawed world, defended by its most beautiful flaws. The irony is exquisite. His form began to fade. When I am done, you will not even have a memory of the struggle you so foolishly champion. You will only have the peace you are too afraid to choose for yourselves. The god of silence vanished, leaving behind the ruined district, the stunned survivors, and a declaration of a war that would be fought not for territory or power, but for the right of reality itself to exist. At that moment, Kenshin Izanagi and a squad of loyal Shinigami arrived, their blades drawn. Only to find the battle already over, and their world's fate now resting on the shoulders of the boy they had been sent to destroy. Chapter 7 End. Chapter 8. The Price of Existence. The return to Konoha was nothing like the frantic, desperate plunge they had taken into the Soul Society. Kenshin, his authority temporarily restored by the sheer, undeniable reality of the crisis, had guided them to a more stable, albeit forbidden, dimensional gateway used only for the most covert Onmitsukido operations. The journey back was quick, silent, and heavy with the weight of their impossible victo. Rai and the dawning horror of the war to come. They emerged not in a training ground, but in the deep, shadowy forests south of the village. The air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, was a stark contrast to the sterile, dust-choked atmosphere of the ruined Rukongai. But the peace was a lie. Naruto could feel it instantly. The threads of Konoha were twisted, knotted with tension and fear. A new, dominant color had been woven into the village's tapestry, a cold, gray, emotionless pattern that emanated from the center of the village. It was the color of control. The color of Danzo. Something's wrong, Naruto said, his voice low. Nell, who had reverted to her child form upon leaving the Soul Society, pressed closer to him, her small face mirroring his concern. Kenshin, ever the pragmatist, was already debriefing. My subordinates will establish a secure communication channel between our worlds. We will share all intelligence regarding Malicor. This is a joint operation now, whether my superiors sanction it or not. He gave a stiff, formal bow to Jiraiya and Kakashi. I owe you and your students a debt. Just be ready for the next fight, Captain, Jiraiya said grimly. That's payment enough. As the Shinigami vanished in a flicker of Shunpo to establish their covert base, Naruto's team raced toward the village gates. The scene that greeted them confirmed his worst fears. The guards at the gate were not the usual Chunin with their familiar, easygoing manner. They were Root Anbu, their animal masks cold and impassive, their posture radiating a lethal stillness. They moved with a chilling, synchronized precision, more puppets than people. They didn't try to stop the returning heroes, but their blank, hollow gazes followed them, tracking their every move. The village itself was unnervingly quiet. Civilians scurried through the streets, their heads down, refusing to make eye contact. The usual boisterous energy of Konoha had been replaced by a blanket of subdued fear. Banners bearing the official Konoha leaf insignia now hung beside stark, black flags emblazoned with the ink blot symbol of the Foundation. He didn't just make a move, Kakashi murmured, his visible eye narrowed in disbelief. He's already won. They found the confirmation of their fears in Tsunade's office. Or rather, what used to be her office. The room had been stripped of her personal effects, the gambling paraphernalia, the sake bottles, the stacks of half-finished paperwork. It was now a sterile, brutally efficient command center. And sitting behind her desk, his hands steepled BEF. Or him as if he had sat there his entire life, was Danzo Shimura. Tsunade was nowhere to be seen. Shizune was gone. So, Danzo said, his voice calm, devoid of triumph. It was the voice of a man stating a simple, inarguable fact. The rogue elements have returned. You reek of another world. Your reckless journey has left Konoha vulnerable. Where is she? Naruto demanded, his voice a low growl. Where's Tsunade? The former Hokage has been relieved of her duties, Danzo replied coolly. The council, with the full support of the Jonin commander and the feudal lord, has appointed me acting Hokage to manage this crisis. A crisis she created. She is currently in protective custody, for her own safety. And for the village's. Protective custody. Jiraiya's voice was dangerously quiet. You mean a prison cell? Her emotional and irrational decisions proved her unfit for command in a time of war, Danzo stated, his gaze unwavering. She gambled the village's safety on a fantasy. I have taken the necessary steps to restore order and security. The village is under martial law. A curfew is in effect. All shinobi forces have been recalled to the walls. We will weather this storm through discipline and control. Not wishful thinking. Naruto felt a surge of white-hot rage. He saw the cold, gray threads of Danzo's will wrapped around the entire village, choking the vibrant colors of its people. His first instinct was to act. To reach out with Gamuza, to convince the atoms of Danzo's chair to disassemble, to make the air in his lungs forget its purpose. He had the power. He could end this coup in a single, silent heartbeat. But he stopped. He saw the two Root Anbu standing silently in the corners of the room. He saw the impassive look on Danzo's face. This was what Danzo wanted. He was baiting him. If Naruto used his inexplicable, terrifying power to attack the newly sanctioned leader of the village, he would prove Danzo's every accusation correct. He would become the unstable monster. The threat that needed to be controlled. He would legitimize the very coup he sought to end. He reigned in his power, the effort making his fists tremble. He couldn't win this with force. Not here. Not now. He had to be smarter. He had to use Danzo's own weapon, control, against him. You're a coward, Naruto said, his voice surprisingly calm. You're so afraid of the world that you have to lock it in a cage. That's not strength. It's weakness. Danzo's eye narrowed almost imperceptibly. Your opinion is irrelevant. You and your team are to be confined to your quarters for debriefing and psychological evaluation. Hand over the child. She will be taken to a secure Foundation facility. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. No, Naruto said, the word as solid and final as bedrock. Nell, sensing the shift, hid behind his legs, her small hands gripping his pants. Do not defy me, boy, Danzo warned. I am the Hokage. My word is law. You're not my Hokage, Naruto replied, his blue eyes burning with a cold fire that had been forged in the heart of an unraveling universe. You're just a tyrant sitting in a stolen chair. He turned before Danzo could give the order to his guards. Let's go, he said to his team. He walked out of the office, his back to the most powerful man in Konoha, an act of defiance so profound it was more insulting than any attack. Jiraiya, Kakashi, and Guy, after a moment's hesitation, followed him. The Root Anbu tensed, ready to move, but Danzo raised a single, placating hand. Let them go, he commanded, a thin, predatory smile gracing his lips. Give them enough rope, and they will hang themselves. The village will see their defiance for what it is. Treason. They didn't go to their quarters. They went to the one place in Konoha that Danzo's influence couldn't easily penetrate, the Nara clan compound. Shikaku Nara, clan head, Jonin commander, and a man whose intellect dwarfed even Danzo's, greeted them at the gate, his expression as grim as a funeral dirge. This is a real drag, Shikaku sighed, leading them into the quiet, traditional house. Danzo moved fast. He used the fear from the Sumatai erasure and your disappearance to consolidate power. He presented the council with falsified intelligence suggesting Tsunade was colluding with the Shinigami to sacrifice Konoha. It was clean, it was logical, and it was a complete load of crap. Can't you do something? Jiraiya asked. As Jonin commander, your voice carries weight. My voice is currently being drowned out by his, Shikaku said, gesturing to the window. He's got the civilian council terrified and the shinobi clans on a knife's edge. He's promising security. In times of fear, that's a hard promise to argue with. To move against him now would be to tear the village apart in a civil war. We can't afford that, not with Malachor out there. They were trapped. If they fought Danzo, they risked destroying the village they wanted to protect. If they did nothing, they were prisoners. And Danzo's isolationist policies would leave them completely unprepared for Malachor's next move. Naruto sat in the corner, Nell asleep in his lap, his mind racing. He couldn't fight Danzo physically. He couldn't fight him politically. So he would have to fight him conceptually. He had to change the narrative. Danzo's power was built on a foundation of secrets and lies. Naruto had the power to reveal the truth. He didn't need to be a warrior or a politician. He needed to be an information broker. He spent the next 2 days in a deep, meditative trance, sheltered by the Nara clan's loyalty. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He reached out with Gamuza, his senses extending through the village like an invisible web. He didn't listen to conversations. He listened to the threads themselves. He followed the cold, gray threads of the foundation. He felt the secret tunnels beneath the village, the hidden barracks, the re-education centers. He felt the cursed seals on the tongues of the root Anbu, binding them to silence. And he found what he was looking for, Danzo's secret, central archive. A vault, buried deep beneath the village, where every secret, every blackmail file, every dirty deal was recorded on scrolls sealed with blood and fear. It was the source of his power, the heart of his control. He wouldn't destroy it. He wouldn't steal it. He would simply share it. On the third day, as Danzo was addressing a gathering of clan heads and prominent shinobi in the main council chamber, cementing his authority, it happened. It started with a single scroll, materializing from thin air and landing softly on the table in front of the Hyuga clan head. It was a mission report, detailing a covert route operation to destabilize the land of wood, a mission Hyuga had been officially told was for peaceful reconnaissance. Then another scroll appeared before the Akamichi clan head. It was a detailed account of diverted food and medical supply shipments, annulled to Foundation resources while the village proper faced shortages. Then a flood. Dozens, then hundreds of scrolls began to materialize throughout the room, each appearing before the person most affected by its contents. A secret order to assassinate a foreign dignitary appeared before the ambassador sent to negotiate peace. A record of a coerced confession appeared before the family of the man who was executed. A detailed psychological profile, full of weaknesses and fears, appeared before a Jonin commander who thought Danzo was his staunchest ally. It was not a chaotic explosion of information. It was a surgical, precise, and utterly devastating strike. Naruto, from miles away, was not acting as a teleporter. He was acting as a librarian. He was simply looking at a scroll in a seal, vault and suggesting a new reality. This scroll is not here. It is there, in the hands of the one who deserves to read it. The council chamber descended into chaos. Shouts of anger and betrayal erupted. Alliances that had been built on decades of lies crumbled in seconds. The clan heads, the commanders, the elders, they all turned to look at Danzo, not with fear, but with a cold, murderous fury. They saw him for what he was. Not a protector, but a parasite who had been feeding on the village's trust for years. Danzo sat frozen behind his desk, his face a mask of disbelief. His entire empire, his lifetime of carefully constructed secrets and manipulations, had been dismantled in less than 5 minutes. He had been so focused on Naruto's physical power that he had never considered the possibility of a weapon like this. A weapon of absolute truth. He looked up and met the furious eyes of every powerful person in Konoha. His root Anbu tensed, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. His power was broken. His reign was over. In the Nara compound, Naruto opened his eyes, a thin trickle of blood running from his nose from the sheer mental strain. He had not thrown a punch. He had not raised his voice. But he had just won the cleanest, most decisive battle of his life. He had fought a war of information and achieved total victory. He hadn't destroyed his enemy. He had simply revealed him, and allowed the truth to do the rest. A new respect dawned in Shikaku's eyes as he watched the boy. The raw power of the Jinchuriki was fearsome. But this was the power of a king. Chapter 8 End.